To chapter 15, we will be covering what is freedom, which covers Reconstruction. So this question of what is freedom following the end of the Civil War. You'll remember in your U.S. History 1 course, you left off at the Civil War or at Reconstruction, either one. So this may be a review for you, but it definitely sets up the rest of the semester and all of the things that we're going to talk about. So what exactly is Reconstruction? It's just as it sounds. It's attempting to reunite and reconstruct the nation following the devastation of the Civil War. So trying to fuse the North and the South back together after they'd been so violently separated for years. The nation was split not only physically across the Mason-Dixon line, but psychologically the damage was quite strong. And trying to figure out how to come back together after literally killing each other was a huge job. It was something that many people couldn't even imagine, and they didn't think that this would succeed. So the meaning of freedom kept changing as it had from the beginning of the establishment of the United States, or the beginning of European arrival even, as it continues to. And we continue grappling with this subject of what is freedom. And the South was really struggling at this point because their entire society, they had a slave society that centered around slave work and slave labor, and their economy and their social structure were both based on that. So following the Civil War, following the end of slavery, they had to reconstruct not only their economic system, but their entire social structure as well. There were two major phases that people went through during Reconstruction, what we call the Reconstruction period. And it's a little over a decade long. And the first short phase is presidential Reconstruction. And then the longer phase is radical Reconstruction. And we'll go over those a little bit coming up. So family and social life following the Civil War changed drastically, especially in the South. Many African American families attempted to find family members that they had been separated from during the Second Middle Passage or during the war. You'll remember the first Middle Passage is when African enslaved people were brought over from Africa to North and South America. And the second Middle Passage refers to the movement west. So the expansion of cotton farming to the west required more labor be moved to the west, so enslaved people were oftentimes split up from their families, and some of them were sent out west and some of them remained in the east or in the deep south. Widows of soldiers were receiving pensions. Mostly it was white widows, but some African American widows were also receiving a pension for their husbands having fought in the Civil War and died. And gender roles at this point were still following something that we're not quite used to today in the United States, but the gender roles at this point were that the women would stay at home and the men would go out and work. And what the African American community was looking to do was follow that structure. They hadn't been able to follow that structure under slavery because they had both been enslaved, so they were both sentenced to work. And at this point, they were trying to see if they could have the same sort of social network as white Americans. They wanted for their wives to be able to stay home and take care of the children, and for the men to go to work and earn a wage that was enough to take care of the family. Eventually, most Black women also needed to go to work because the wages weren't high enough that Black men were receiving, and so they couldn't support their whole family, and African American women needed to also find work. There were schools that were established at this point. If you'll recall, it had been illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read and write, and there weren't strong schools set up at this point to begin with. And if there were, they certainly didn't allow African American children to enter. So there were schools set up by Northern missionaries and the Freedmen's Bureau and ex-slaves themselves. The Freedmen's Bureau was the group that was in charge of dealing with this newfound freedom, this legal freedom that people had once they were released from slavery. Another aspect of family and social life that was solidified at this point was the creation of churches of their own. So African Americans established Methodist and Baptist churches, and they had about 250 Black ministers who actually held office during Reconstruction. So oftentimes the leader of the religious institution had also been considered the leader of the intellectual circle and social circle. And so sending these people to hold office during Reconstruction meant that more people's voices would be heard. And it may be surprising to you, knowing what is to come, that African American men were allowed to hold political office at this point. It did last throughout Reconstruction, but not without backlash. And it eventually ceased to be that way. And we'll see a large gap in time where people weren't allowed to serve in office. Churches were the center of the family and social life in that they were used for worship, school, social events, and political events and discussions. So they were sort of this town hall for people following the Civil War. Political freedoms were always a question. So the vote was still seen as the ultimate freedom, as well as the ability to own property. And not having the vote was a sign of second-class citizenship. So all women and all non-white men at this point had no access to the vote. This was starting to expand a little bit under Reconstruction in the hopes that they would be able to mend the nation back together and integrate those who had been enslaved. Eric Foner, the author of Give Me Liberty, the textbook on which these lectures are based, and the companion book to your Voices of Freedom documentary book, said self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic autonomy were these political freedoms that people wanted. So those were the basic rights that people were hoping to obtain during this time. Black Americans began celebrating the 4th of July, which just passed for us, but they began celebrating the 4th of July and asked for soldier sacrifices during the Civil War to be recognized. So they wanted veterans of the Civil War to be recognized regardless of their race. And by celebrating the 4th of July, they thought that they would be able to show the country that they were active participants in the country and that they were dedicated patriots. Black men were beginning to serve in office, as we noted before, and this was a huge change. So it didn't go swimmingly at this point, you could say. It had been so long, a couple centuries, that people had this hierarchy set up, and by obliterating it and allowing people to go into office, some people weren't able to deal with that in an appropriate way and threatened violence or committed violence against those who decided to participate in the political realm. The Freedmen's Bureau that we mentioned before was established in March 1865 and lasted for about 5 years. It existed to support the newly freed African Americans and the formerly enslaved population. They were in charge of establishing schools, providing aid to the elderly, and they were also in charge of settling disputes between blacks and whites. And what that meant was trying to secure equal treatment before the law. Oftentimes, people weren't allowed to take others to court if they were African American and the person they were taking to court was white. they the Freedmen's Bureau was attempting to be sort of a mediator in between. Healthcare and hospitals, including the administration of drugs, was extremely important as well. Many enslaved people had no access to medical treatment, and as a newly freed person, they also had limited access to the white hospitals and the white doctors. So there were special hospitals that were set up for them. Land reform was a huge part of what the Freedmen's Bureau was involved in as well, and they had this program where they called it Sherman Land, and it was to divide into 40-acre plots. So the 40 acres and a mule kind of thing that you've probably heard about. The idea was to give people plots of land that they could farm for themselves so that they could become self-sustainable. If no land reform, this would mean that African Americans would have to go back to work for white property owners. So having land was key to meaningful freedom. So many of the people who were freed from slavery at the end of the Civil War ended up having to go back to work for the same people who had held them in slavery before. They didn't have any other options for work, so they had to turn around and go back and settle for meager wages most of the time. Sharecropping became a popular form of employment at this point, and the traditional task labor and supervised wage labor still existed, and that was this wage work that you would see where people would go in for a certain amount of hours, or they would be given a particular task that they had to complete, and they would be paid a certain amount based on either how long it took or the task being completed itself. Cotton and tobacco were actually sharecropped at this point, and you can see the infographic over here in the bottom right corner. This is the cycle of poverty that the sharecroppers often became involved in. And this was not just African Americans entering into these deals. There were also poor white farmers who were entering into this system who couldn't seem to make it on their own, and it sort of ends up being like the payday loan situations that you hear about, where people just need to keep paying more and more, and they're perpetually in debt. So one part of the rent, one would rent part of the plantation, and the haul would be divided between the owner and the renter at the end of the year. When they couldn't necessarily make it, or they had needed to take out a loan beforehand, then they owed more money to the person at the end of the year. So white farmers ended up sharecropping as well, and between all of the financially strapped people who participated in this program, most of them stayed within it because it was this cycle where they needed to keep making more because they owed more to the farm owner. Crop lien was also used as part of the crop was collateral to obtain a loan to purchase things from merchants, like tools that they needed or seeds, but then they needed to continually get more loans. So it was not a particularly profitable cycle for anybody who was doing the work of it. The landowner certainly made out on these deals. White Southerners following the Civil War were adapting to a lot of change that many of them felt was sudden. So there were about 260,000 dead Confederate soldiers, and that was about a fifth of the adult white males. There was no more slave labor. Much of the land had been destroyed. Many of the animals were dead, and there was a lot of non-functioning infrastructure. This meant that the economy basically collapsed. The entirety of what they had been doing before couldn't be done in the same way. So they were trying to figure that out, and eventually the North sent troops in to try to help figure that out. And there were also groups from the North who went down to try to help them reset their lives. The hierarchy was actually maintained, for the most part, the racial hierarchy that they had set up before. While legally there was no more enslavement, the legal and social realities are often quite different from each other. In this case, the social reality was to act as if freedom was a privilege and not a right. So white Southerners believed, many of them believed, that they had earned this privilege to be free, and that it was not simply a right that was given to people legally as it had been at the end of the Civil War. And foreigners quoted as saying that Black people were free, but free only to labor. So they weren't necessarily free to go to the limited colleges that existed at the time. They weren't free to go to the limited K through 12 schools that existed. They weren't free to own their own plantations if they wanted to. You get the idea that they were still only going to be hired to do menial labor. The idea throughout the South was that whites felt that they were now on the bottom of the hierarchy following the war, as they'd been humiliated, and it had changed their entire structure of living. They wanted to ensure that there were still others on the bottom of the heap, so they weren't the absolute most wretched. So by maintaining this racial hierarchy, they, in part, were hoping to save themselves from being on the bottom of the pile. The aftermath of the Civil War is obviously still ongoing in some ways, but the immediate aftermath, cities saw more improvements with connections to the north and trade markets via the railroad system, which was expanding and being repaired following the war. So there were improvements in the railroads, which led to people being able to ship things more efficiently. Land, control of labor, and political power were major concerns for most people in the southern states. So they were hoping that they would be able to move on their own with more limited supervision from the north and maintain some level of states' rights that they were hoping to get out of the war. Women and children were taken out of the manual labor positions. So this was referring to former enslaved people, and they were put into inside work if need be. So many of them became domestics at this point rather than working in the fields. Many of the formerly money-making enterprises fell apart as many plantations began to fail in their current state, and instead they were set up into individual parcels of land. This is not only the 40 acres that we talked about with the Freedmen's Bureau, but people had to section off their land and sell it in much smaller portions and as much smaller farms in order to not completely go under. The right to vote for African Americans, including the formerly enslaved population of men in the United States, was a surprise to many in the Western Hemisphere. Some other nations had granted the right to vote for people who had come out of enslavement already throughout Latin America and in Europe, but the United States, it was a surprise to many people that they made this turnaround so quickly. And as we know, it didn't necessarily last in any real way for many decades, and we'll get into that throughout this semester. Presidential Reconstruction is the first part of Reconstruction. So I'll give a little bit of an overview here, and this is the nitty-gritty of presidential Reconstruction. So this is the first 2 years of this about 12-year period. President Andrew Johnson oversaw this part of Reconstruction, and the major goal here was to restore the Union, so to join North and South back together so that they wouldn't immediately split up again. This was an extremely fragile time, and he was trying to make sure that the states wouldn't split back up. And he was in favor of allowing the South to pursue states' rights rather than dictating from the capital. So even though there had just been a war fought over the limitations of states to make up their own mind about particular things, especially slavery, he was hoping that by offering the southern states some rights to define their own state laws, that they would not rebel once again. Johnson did pardon white Southerners who pledged allegiance to the United States, excluding Confederate leaders and the ultra-wealthy. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States, was jailed for 2 years following the war until he was pardoned. If people decided that they would become part of the United States, and if they turned away, that they would be committing treason, he decided that it was okay for them to be a part of rebuilding the nation. And you can imagine that if he had executed all of the top Confederates, that may not have gone over well, and people wouldn't have necessarily decided that they wanted to remain within the Union. He demanded that slavery remain illegal, and so that was not up for reconsideration in this presidential Reconstruction period or in the following Reconstruction period. And as you know, we have not legally reinstituted slavery at this point. And secession needed to remain something that was off the table, and the states should be able to decide how things progress for themselves, but that they needed to remain part of the Union, and they needed to keep slavery off the table. Leaving it up to the states inevitably led to violence. So there were a lot of rebellions based on federal law and based on state law, and by not having specific rules against violence against African Americans, for example, many people took advantage of that following the Civil War. Eventually, Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives, but was not removed from office by the Senate. It requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate to remove somebody from office, but impeachment and removal from office are not the same thing. So the House of Representatives could say that this person is not fit to do their job, but it is up to the Senate to say that they are fired, essentially. He was impeached because of noncompliance with tenure of office rules for the Secretary of War. And he obviously survived this impeachment attempt, but it was relatively close, and very few people have been impeached by the House of Representatives throughout history. So it is notable that this happened during this time. We'll move on to some of the black codes that were laws regulating freemen's behavior, especially in the South. So there were a few things that were now allowed. Marriage, property ownership, and limited access to the courts. We talked about there being some level of inability for African Americans to go to court against white people. And what these codes did was provide these few things, but it actually denied many more things. So they were not allowed to testify against whites in the court. They were not allowed to serve on juries. So any jury that was set up for an African American person who was accused of a crime would be all white. And they were also not allowed to join militias and not allowed to vote. So this was not across the entirety of the South, but different states made up their own minds. And in some states, African Americans still couldn't vote. And those without work could be arrested and sent to work for plantation owners. So they could be sentenced to doing manual labor for free, for not having had a job, but there was limited access to jobs to begin with. So many people ended up in a relatively similar situation than they had been before. Child labor was sometimes assigned without parental consent, so even children of African Americans were being maltreated following their freedom. And this was obviously not because the children didn't obtain their own job, but if someone needed extra hands and the adults, the parents were already working for people, they could have the child also assigned to labor. Radical Republicans were this group of Republicans at this point that wanted to oust Confederates from the new governments in the South because they were quite sure that the same thing would happen that had happened prior to the war. And they wanted to essentially clear the board. They fought for allowing Black men to have the vote, and they fought for equality regardless of race. And this was a huge step. So this is why they're titled Radical Republicans. They weren't just middle of the road. They obviously weren't extremely conservative, and the whole concept of Republicans and Democrats has sort of evolved over time. So we've had similar words throughout decades and well over a century at this point, but it doesn't always mean the same thing. It sort of revolves around what time it is in history and how much people had to be concerned about. So at this point, Republicans were often aligned with freedom, with freeing people from slavery, with freeing people up to obtain work, and the Southern Democrats at this point had been the ones that were in favor of continuation of slavery. And these many of the finer details of these parties were more centrist than what we're used to now. And many of the major ideas have sort of been in flux over the years. We'll talk about that throughout this whole course. And redistribution of land belonging to disloyal planters was another thing that the radical Republicans were interested in at this point. So there was a strong history of belief in property rights that caused this to drag on and not really come to fruition. So the redistribution of land, rather than allowing disloyal planters who had fought against the nation, they were oftentimes allowed to keep these large parcels of land if they were financially stable enough to take care of it. What you have in this time frame is also the origin of modern civil rights. Certainly, it didn't move up to the point that we're talking about eventually in the 1960s or even today. But this is where you can start to really see this movement taking form. Most Republicans wanted to modify presidential Reconstruction rather than completely scrap it because they thought people wouldn't go along with former enslaved people being able to vote. There were two bills that were put up at this point. They wanted to extend the Freedmen's Bureau, and that was vetoed, and the Civil Rights Bill was vetoed but overturned. So the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 stated that all those born in the United States were U.S. citizens. It also stated that there was equality before the law. And Johnson vetoed this because he didn't think that African Americans should have citizenship rights, and that the states should be able to make their own laws. This was the first major law to have a 2/3 majority in order to overturn the veto and make it law over the president's protest. So, important for several reasons. By saying that those born in the United States were citizens, that was a huge step. That would mean that they would have the right to vote. It would mean that they would have the right to participate as full citizens. There were several amendments and acts that we should also mention that came about during this time frame. The 14th Amendment, which is extremely important for us to know about, stated that citizenship for all born in the United States and the federal government is allowed to ensure the amendment's enforcement if states are not holding up their end of agreement. So this meant that citizenship was granted to everyone who was born here, and the federal government was allowed to tell the states what to do in this case, basically. And they were allowed to essentially force the states to comply with the law. And this also allowed African Americans to vote under the threat of losing seats in Congress. So if the southern states didn't allow African Americans to vote, they would have seats in their representation taken away. The Reconstruction Act is another act that we should talk about at this point. And it's extremely important to think about that this divided the South into 5 military regions. So you can see the military regions in the upper right. And this created new state governments. Black men were given the right to vote. And it was again over Johnson's veto. So military regions meant that Northern troops had taken over the southern states and were ensuring compliance with the new laws. And many people saw this as an occupation and were threatening to rebel once again against the Union. So you can imagine this was quite tense. People throughout the South enforcing the new laws under threat of violence right after the Civil War. And this Reconstruction Act sort of led to the beginning of radical Reconstruction, which lasted for the next 10 years. And we talked about the attempted removal of office of Johnson, but that was a huge marker in this sense of dissatisfaction with the reuniting of the North and the South and the way that things were going on the highest levels. The 15th Amendment in 1869, so 2 years into radical Reconstruction, states that the state and federal government are prohibited from denying the vote based on race. Literacy tests, poll taxes, property qualifications, and gender were all ways to get around that. So no women were allowed to vote still at this point, whether they were African American or white or Latina. And this was one way to get around saying that everybody was allowed to vote. The literacy tests were quite difficult because many people couldn't read or write still at this point, but especially African Americans couldn't read or write at this point because it had been illegal to teach them how to read and write while they were enslaved. And poll taxes were equally discriminatory because most people couldn't afford it if they had just been freed from slavery. And you might be thinking, well, there were poor white people who couldn't read and write, and there were poor white people who couldn't pay taxes on the polls, but oftentimes they were just granted the right to come in based on personal recognizance, and the African American voters were not given the same sort of consideration. Women were not allowed to vote at this point still, and many of them suggested that while changes were being made to the Constitution and the way the country was run, women should be included. And this was not a new idea. This had happened during the Revolutionary War also, stating that they were creating a new society and that women should be included. And they weren't mostly included at that point. And it would be many years until they were fully brought into the circle. Free labor was one of the requests that women were looking for at the time, and this meant a right to work and earn wages, and fair wages, based on the work that they were doing. They were also looking to have the availability to obtain a divorce if they needed one, and they wanted the right to their own bodies. And many women were still subject to their husband's whims, either under their legal situations. So they often couldn't sign contracts. They couldn't enter work without their husband's permission. And then their wages belonged to their husbands as well. And also, it should be noted, it wasn't until the 1990s, so within my lifetime, that the concept of marital rape was solidified in the Supreme Court. So that was one of the things that women were fighting for as well. They wanted the right to say no if they didn't want to engage. And male supporters at the time who had been supporters of women's rights or had been involved in the emancipation movement, which was closely linked with women's rights, stated that they wanted to focus on Black men's rights rather than take women's rights into consideration at the same time. They were looking to make one step at a time, essentially. And the problem with that is it sounds like people are saying you either can do this or you can do that, which is not the case. All of these things could have been done at the same time. But by posing it as, well, if we focus on women's rights, we won't have focused at all on Black men's rights. Many men wanted Black men to be the next step, because many of the men in the North, many of the white men in the North, realized that their lives would change should they free up women to have equal rights with them. So half the population still remained under very limited rights, and it's not to say that African American men's rights expanded greatly at this point in any permanent way, but that was the main focus. There was a split in the women's approach to obtaining these rights. Some women ended up resorting to racism, suggesting that native-born white women were more capable than Blacks or immigrants, and this would suggest that their voting rights and other legal benefits should be focused on first because they were going to be more capable than these other groups. Some believed that they should still support rights for African American men, and it was a step in the right direction, even if it didn't necessarily benefit them. So they were looking at building this structure of expanding rights and knowing that African American men still required access to all of these things. They didn't necessarily want to pull them down just because they weren't going to get to the same place. There were two major groups that women were involved in, and they were the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this was the older and more traditional approach to women's rights. And there was also the American Women's Suffrage Association. So there's the national and the American. The American one is led by Lucy Stone, and this was the younger and more radical approach to women's rights. Many times, in order to argue against women's rights, there were appeals to religion and the natural way of things. It was a popular tactic throughout history to keep oppressed groups down, because if it's said that they're naturally or biologically less capable than one group or another, that would mean that there was some sort of evidence there. Or if it was a religious thing, that would mean that God had ordained it to be this way. And there's little to no argument that people would hear against that. Radical Reconstruction in the South looked pretty chaotic. So there were sit-ins and protests and strikes and lectures that were all used to get information out, that the laws were finally in African American men's favor and that they should take advantage of new opportunities. So you can see in this drawing on the right, these were the first Black senators and representatives in the United States. There were campaigns that were put in place to attempt to register African American men to vote. So people would go from town to town attempting to register them and encourage them to go to the polls when the times came. Many people were afraid to go to the polls because they were afraid they would face violence or they would simply be turned away. So convincing people to start participating in these laws was sometimes dangerous work, and it was certainly tiring work. In 1868 and 1869, there were funded public facilities like schools, asylums, jails, and orphanages. So having the funding to run these things meant that there was this bringing African Americans into the major social group within the United States by providing these particular facilities. The Radical Reconstruction in the South also did away with whipping, jailing for debts, and property requirements for office holders. So they were trying to open up this ability to serve in public office. They were trying to do away with corporal punishment. And jailing for debts was a huge issue. We talked about sharecropping, so people were perpetually in debt at this point, and by not jailing them, it allowed them to stay out and continue to try to make more money to pay back whatever debts they owed. There were about 2,000 Black office holders during Radical Reconstruction. So Pinckney B.S. Pinchback was the Louisiana governor and was the last African American governor of Louisiana until 1989. So they went over 100 years without having another African American governor. And he was the son of a formerly enslaved woman and the plantation owner who had been her master. So he was mixed race, Black and white, and had managed to gain the seat of governor during this time. But as we talked about before, this sort of availability to climb up in the ranks like that wasn't available in the century to come. Carpetbaggers and scalawags, these are not just fun-sounding words, or just Rhett Butler if you've seen Gone with the Wind, but carpetbaggers were referred to as such. They were Northerners who went to the South following the war in order to reap the spoils of office. So in reality, some of these were soldiers who had stayed in the South and never returned to the North, but some of them had come from the North to go down and essentially find positions of power that weren't available to them in the North. Scalawags were white Southern-born Republicans who had sided with the Union during the war, and these were, many of these people were inspired by this one group of people called the Free State of Jones, and they established this little independent area within the southern states, and they had decided that they would fight with the Union. They wanted things to change, and they did not want to be part of the Confederate States, essentially. And so they were called scalawags after the war. And they were obviously looked on unfavorably by those who had decided to pull away from the Union. Southern Republicans passed a number of laws in favor of African Americans, but there was still a legal versus social reality to contend with. So the laws were in place, they were attempting to ensure equal rights, and the reality was that many people still drew a social hierarchy in a particular way, and they weren't open to these changes or inviting these changes into their day-to-day life, even if they were the law. There were many opponents to Reconstruction. Many of them had been planters or merchants or Southern Democrats, and they were opposed to the way that Reconstruction had played out because it had taken away many of the advantages people who had been planters, merchants, or political figures had held. There were some what they conceived of as examples of Black supremacy by allowing for protection under the law and for access to service in the government. So they were seeing this protection based on race as an example of an attempt at Black supremacy. There were rising taxes for public amenities like schools and the railroad that left many people angry following financial ruin during the war. So many land parcels had been destroyed. There were lots of infrastructure issues following the war that all needed to be fixed. And the expansion of the school system to African Americans also took money. So having to pay taxes to create these things created a lot of resentment. Former enslaved people voting and holding office was too much for many of the people who were living in the South. They couldn't stomach the idea that their lives had been completely turned upside down in such a short amount of time, and so drastically that the people who had formerly been enslaved could then be legally one of their leaders. So these were people who were opposed to the idea of Reconstruction on a grand scale and then opposed to some very specific ideas throughout it. The KKK is one of the more famous groups that was opposed to Reconstruction, and they had the goal of preventing African Americans from voting, and they also had a goal of enacting political assassinations of white Republicans who supported the radical Reconstructionist agenda. So they were going after African Americans, most famously, but they were also going after the white politicians who were attempting to help them. So in 1866 in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan was formed, and these were terrorists who targeted Unionists, teachers, Republicans, and most notably African Americans. And in 1871, in Meridian, Mississippi, there were 30 African Americans and a white judge who were murdered by the Klan. This is one of the more famous massacres from the time. And a couple years later, in Colfax, Louisiana, there were hundreds of former enslaved people who were murdered, including militia who had surrendered, and they were murdered by the KKK. The Klan did have a brief hiatus, but as we know, they continued to enact this reign of terror, and they're actually still a recognized hate group today. So they haven't gone away. They've sort of had this staying power. And a lot of this has to do with this waning support for Reconstruction. So there was this fervor and this intentionality behind creating this new nation following the Civil War, kind of hitting reset. But many of the opposition tried to pull down these ideas and tried to push people from the center more towards their ideas. So with the dying out of the radical Republicans, they became older, or many of them were killed. The country was left with a more moderate centrist version. And there was a rise in elitism, which is pushing out democracy again. So there was this idea that the rich should remain in power, and that the people were unable to decide for themselves what was right and what should happen. And many blamed the economic situation in the South on Black leadership in government and called for their removal from office. So it was sort of this easy target, low-hanging fruit, these new participants within the government, and blaming this financial situation that was following a war on them allowed some sort of scapegoating that people were more readily willing to accept. There was an economic depression in 1873 that took attention away from pursuing freedom, and people were mostly focused on their own individual economic situation at this point. So things could happen behind the scenes that people weren't going to be outraged by because they were so focused on their day-to-day survival. There was a group that called themselves the Redeemers, that were white Southerners, saying that they were redeeming the South in the face of corruption from the North and from African Americans, and that this was sort of a signal that Confederates were coming back into power. So the idea had been to not allow those who had seceded from the nation to regain power, but many of them did. And the bargain of 1877 is famous because it signifies the end of Reconstruction. So Rutherford B. Hayes was president at the time, and he recognized the South's control and ended military occupation of the region. So he recalled the troops from the southern states, those 5 regions that we talked about. The Southern leaders said that they would respect African Americans' rights and political advantages in exchange for being left alone by the Republicans. This obviously didn't work out, and many of the northern states and the federal government itself essentially turned a blind eye and left things up to the states themselves. So we see an end to this strong attempt at recreating the southern states and sort of backing off in order to ensure that the southern states would remain within the Union and not rebel again. So that's the basic notion of Reconstruction, and we'll keep moving forward from that point. But that's the attempt at stitching the nation back together following the Civil War. So you will read in The Voices of Freedom a petition of Black residents of Nashville, Frederick Douglass on the Composite Nation, and Robert B. Elliott on civil rights. And you'll respond in the writing assignment as dictated on Blackboard